After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. I'm joined in the virtual studio today by Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Angus.
Had so much fun in our 100th episode that I've come back for our 101st.
Yes.
Yeah, very exciting. And we do get to do your favourite thing today, which is talk about what long-dead Greeks thought about war. You must be pumped.
I'm so pumped for this.
Yeah.
It's definitely my favourite thing to talk about.
We'll explain exactly what we're talking about in a second. It's come about because of Donald Trump's state visit to China, which took place late last week.
Mm-hmm.
The president, along with quite a cast of characters from his administration and the business community, hello, Elon, it's been a while, visited China last week for a 3-day visit.
President Xi's an incredible guy, got along, made a lot of great trade deals, including over 200 planes from Boeing. The farmers are going to be very happy. They're going to be buying billions of dollars of soybeans.
We got some of the usual hyperbole from the Trump administration about doing historic deals and, etc. But what did we actually learn?
Not much, I don't think. In terms of actual substance coming out of this meeting, there wasn't a whole lot. There was some stuff about soybeans, about China agreeing to buy American soybeans. But beyond that, there really wasn't any kind of substance about, critical issues like tariffs, for example.
Remember them?
Trump was actually asked about them after the meeting and he sort of said, oh, no, we didn't talk about that, which I thought was quite funny. So it was kind of high level, very symbolic. There were lots of photo opportunities. There were lots of demonstrations of what is often described in these things as mutual respect, which is very important to both Xi and Trump. I listened to some coverage that described them as quite similar in that way, in their need, I guess, for that kind of affirmation, I guess, of their power and their status. And we know, of course, that that's a huge thing for Trump. But much was also made, and, we'll get to, I guess, how the security establishment is handling all this, not well. Much was made of Trump's kind of almost demonstrations, I think, of subservience is too strong a word, but, he kind of almost like bowed to Xi a couple of times as they were shaking hands. And, as Trump does, clearly admired and fairly brazenly admired Xi's power and, his hold over the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese government, his ability to create these huge events and these photo opportunities. Trump loves that. And I think, in that sense, Xi gave Trump exactly what he wanted without having to give him any real substance in return. So really, it seems like both parties in that sense are viewing this meeting as a success and both seem to be very pleased about the fact that there'll be another meeting in September. So they confirmed that Xi will go to Washington. And I think the security boys are kind of reassuring themselves that that's when the substance might appear. But we'll wait and see.
I'm sure it's coming. So this is obviously happening in the context of the US and Israel's illegal war on Iran. Was there any progress there in terms of China and the US working together to, open the Strait of Hormuz, for example?
Like maybe a tiny bit, but I think you'd have to go searching pretty hard for it, So in the lead up, of course, there was a lot made of this because of what the media will often describe as China's reliance on Iranian oil. But, as we had James Lawrenson on the show a while ago, and he made it clear that, it's not that straightforward. And actually the Chinese economy is not suffering as much as it is assumed because of this war. And it was, I guess, the way it was set up was that, Trump would go and sort of insist that China would use its leverage with Tehran to put pressure on the regime to reopen the Strait of Hormuz because China needs that to happen. that's not really how it played out. And Trump was sort of uncharacteristically careful, I think, about the way he spoke about this, where he said, he wasn't going to ask for favors, because if you ask for favors, then you have to do favors in return. And we know that that's not his style, although he does kind of assume with pretty much anyone else that, they can do him favors and he doesn't have to do anything in return. But I think we'll get to this. There's some interesting things going on there about that kind of equality of status almost between Xi and Trump, in that Trump kind of treats Xi quite differently.
Yeah, I mean, it is striking that there was that there was nothing really bizarre. Like so often under the Trump presidency, under the second Trump presidency in particular, something fucking weird has happened every time every time there's been a kind of major diplomatic event. Like, I mean, often in the White House on Trump's own terms, I feel like.
Yeah.
But, thinking about Zelensky or the South African leader or,
jokes about Pearl Harbor with the Japanese
in front of the
leader.
Japanese prime minister. Yeah.
One thing you don't want to signal too much, when we go in, we went in very hard and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right?
There didn't seem to be any of that from what I saw.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean about him being sort of uncharacteristically careful and almost deferential. That was really striking coming out of this visit. And it also, meant that there wasn't, and again, I think this is unsurprising given the structural conditions that we're talking about, there wasn't really any progress on Iran. Trump's clearly not willing to directly ask for help. And I think it's unlikely he'd get it anyway from the Chinese leader. So, in terms of substance on Iran, really not much. And since Trump's gotten back to the States, we've kind of reverted to the status quo where he's saying that, Iran better put something on the table fast or they won't, basically, repeating his threats to, in a less direct way, but basically repeating his threats to obliterate Iran if they don't give him what he wants.
Yeah. So we've reached the point, long dead Greeks. In his opening remarks, Chinese President Xi Jinping invoked Thucydides when talking about Taiwan. What's going on there?
I'm so upset that you're making me do this. I knew as soon as I saw it and sent you the screenshot that she had brought up Thucydides. Okay, so what kind of international relations person would I be if I didn't at some point on our podcast talk about Thucydides? So during this meeting, she reportedly brought up the idea of the Thucydides trap to Trump, saying that, the two great powers shouldn't be sucked into this trap and that they should be able to avoid it.
And this is specifically over Taiwan.
That's right, specifically over Taiwan. And this is a concept that has long been applied to the United States and China, which comes out of ancient Greece. And basically the argument is that when there is a hegemon, a single global power, so the United States is clearly the hegemon in this case, especially post-Cold War. And when there is a rising power, aka China, the likelihood of conflict between those, as the established power can't handle the challenge to its power by the rising power, that conflict is likely, if not inevitable. And this comes out of ancient Greece and the war between Athens and Sparta, and particularly a framing of this by Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian. And then it was revived by an American political scientist, underline political air quotes scientist, not a historian, called Graham Allison, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School. And the international relations boys just fucking love this idea, right? They're obsessed with it. It comes up in every security journal article. It comes up all the time about this, this kind of grand theory of international relations. And the one constant is that war between great powers is inevitable. And as you can probably hear from my voice, I find this quite annoying. Partly because, as our colleague Alan Beam likes to say, what some blokes thought about war, several millennia ago is not really relevant to our significantly changed circumstances. Because, since then, like as Alan likes to say, we discovered this thing called law, right? and the lessons of Athenian Spartan rival don't necessarily apply to the United States and China. And what this idea does, I think, as well, is kind of reinforce this idea that war is inevitable. So, I was predictably enraged by some ABC coverage because, of course, after she raised this issue, there's all these like, what is the Thucydides Trap and how does it apply to the United States and China? And the ABC, as one of the explainers in the ABC put it, China is considered the rising power that challenges US hegemony. The countries aren't at the stage of war yet, but political scientists who talk about the Thucydides Trap warn the tension could be a precursor to violent clashes. Right, so it reinforces this idea constantly that war is inevitable. And so much has been made of Xi's invocation of this, partly because of that context, because the security boys just go wild for it, but also because, it implicitly frames the United States as the declining power, right? It is the global hegemon, but it's being challenged by this rising power. And that power shift is inevitable. Now, Trump contested this and said that that's not what she meant. He meant that the US was in decline under Biden. Yeah. But now
2 years ago, we were in decline. And now
he's reversed all that.
Yeah,
obviously.
We're great again.
So Trump seems to be fine with it, but it has sent the rest of the security establishment a little bit wild. And actually, do you want to hear my theory about why she raised this?
Please.
This is based on nothing but vibes, just to clarify. I have no evidence of this. I actually think she did it deliberately in order to kind of confound the US security establishment, right? Because we know, and we've talked about this a lot on the show, that there is this real tension in the Trump administration between, the kind of Elon Musks and the sometimes Trump himself, who have this kind of transactional view of China, admiration of Xi, dollar signs in their eyes around trade and business.
Yeah,
blah,
what
blah,
they do in their own neighborhood, blah, 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 what we do in our neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. It's all fine. We'll
exactly.
just work it out.
Yeah, we don't care about any of that moral, political bullshit. It's just money.
Yeah.
And then I guess what we're more used to in Australia, the more, security hawkish, like China bad, US good types, I think she's playing right into that rivalry and kind of deliberately sending it into a tailspin. Like he would know very well that Trump doesn't necessarily know what that means. Like Trump's like me. Every time he sees it, he's like frantically Googling, what is the fucking Thucydides Trap again?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my theory of why she did that. And certainly it's worth saying that reporting on this in China, reporting on the reporting in China is certainly saying that little qualification Trump had about the US now not being in decline, none of that appeared in the Chinese coverage. I think the meaning was clear. But it does, I think it plays into that effort that Trump seems quite comfortable with to put Trump and Xi on the same level, as leaders of great powers on a basis of equality. And from that perspective, it seems like she would be very happy with how this meeting went.
Yeah. It went so much better than I expected. You were so annoyed.
I feel like I swore less than...
And for anyone playing at home, if you really want to see Dr. Emma's head explode, if you're in a social situation or, you see her at a conference or something, arrange for a white guy to come up and explain Sun Tzu to her. It's a thing of beauty. You can see the life force draining in real time. It's beautiful.
See, this is why I never would have made it in any official diplomatic capacity because I cannot control my face.
On Taiwan, he feels very strongly. I made no commitment either way.
No, nothing's changed. I will say this. I'm not looking to have somebody go independent and, we're supposed to travel 9,500 miles to fight a war. I'm not looking for that. I want them to cool down. I want China to cool down.
U.S. policy on the issue of Taiwan is unchanged as of today and as of the meeting that we had here today. It was raised. They always raise it on their side. We always make clear our position, and we move on to the other topics. We know where they stand, and I think they know where we stand.
So it's interesting that you bring up that tension within the Trump administration. The China hawks on one side, Marco Rubio, etc., and the let's all make money kind of people. I'm particularly interested in what this means for Australia because, I mean, for quite some time now, the framing in Australia, particularly within government circles, has been more along the lines of that kind of China hawk approach. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense about how the Australian government, how Australian kind of security and international relations types are dealing and negotiating with this more chaotic approach to China under Trump? Like it is a very big shift, even from Biden, right? Like who was very clear, you know.
Too clear, I think.
Yeah. How's this being covered in Australia, and how's the security establishment in Australia kind of coping with this?
I think they are deeply worried because, of course, a lot of the narrative around Australia's relationship with the United States under Trump implicitly is pointed towards China. You know, we need to stick with Trump no matter what because China bad. And Trump kind of repeatedly disrupts that, you know, when he, you know, intimates, as he did after this trip, that he's not too worried about Taiwan, of course, which, you know, becomes the center of all this narrative again. So Trump said on Air Force One on the way back, about Taiwan in particular, you know, we're supposed to travel 9,500 miles to fight a war. I'm not looking for that. I want them to cool down. And in Australia and in the US as well, you know, all of these words are kind of passed constantly for what they mean. And there are, I think the hawkish security types are desperately trying to find meaning in that, where, you know, what Trump is saying is like he doesn't want to fight a war, but he will, you know, if China does go after Taiwan, if China does invade Taiwan, that the United States will fight a war. Now, I don't think that's what Trump was saying at all. I think he's saying basically what he's always said is that, you know, he doesn't care that much about Taiwan. Like he doesn't care for these kind of established security narratives. He doesn't care for what Biden did, which was to go even further than the usual strategic ambiguity, so-called strategic ambiguity of the United States, to explicitly say a couple of times that the United States would go to war with China over Taiwan. And hawkish types in Australia absolutely loved that. And so what Trump is doing, as he always does, is upending all of that and putting those security types within the government and outside it, and particularly in the security agencies of the United States, in this really difficult position where they don't know whether they don't know how to say, oh, well, don't listen to Trump, what Trump says, like pay attention to the security agencies and the broader establishment in the United States. Like you can ignore the president, which, you know, doesn't really fly. And it's deeply uncomfortable for agencies that are looking for strategic consistency to be battered about all the time by, you know, what Trump is doing and what Trump is saying. And so there was, like, I pulled out one example. There was an article in the Australian Financial Review that wrote with kind of understated horror that President Donald Trump has signalled an openness to putting US support for Taiwan on the bargaining table as he seeks a breakthrough with China to end the war in Iran. Now, I mean, even drawing that out of what Trump was saying, I think is potentially a stretch. I mean, I think it's true. Like, I think Trump would absolutely be willing to do that. But again, there's all this kind of search for meaning in this broader great power competition that Trump is upending because, you know, in this meeting with Xi, and I mean, it's worth emphasizing that this is potentially all temporary. You know, we know that Trump changes what he's saying, what he's doing in response to the last person he spoke to. And it just so happens that the last person he spoke to over the weekend was Xi Jinping. But it is also possible, you know, and Xi described this. He said that the United States and China's relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And even that is kind of shifting the way that it's talked about, like that maybe this isn't a great power rivalry anymore. Maybe this is a new form of bilateral relationship between two strongmen, right? And the point is we don't know. Yeah. And we absolutely should not get ahead of ourselves in this, especially where Trump is concerned. But certainly it is, I think, contributing to that greater sense of upheaval in the Australian security establishment, where they are just not sure what to make of Trump and what it means for Australia, and are desperately trying to hold on to old notions of, US good, China bad, Australia on the side of good. That was never real, of course. Like, we talk about that all the time, but Trump makes it harder to hold on to.
Yeah, no
and
doubt.
I think maybe I'm taking it too far, but I think Xi was just pointedly with his little Thucydides reference, just underlining that a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, when the US is seemingly lurching back and forth about what its own interests are in Asia, then that would surely make it hard. That seems to make it pretty hard for Australian analysts and, Australian security people to make the argument that the US isn't going to be an unreliable ally to us. That's something we talked about last week. And I mean, like, on Trump, like, at risk of falling into that trap of reading too much into, whatever he says at any given moment. I mean, there is some ideological consistency there, right? Like that, a guy who's perfectly happy invading Venezuela, or perfectly happy, that he might not have such a big problem with someone else doing the same, maybe for face saving purposes, or for like power projection purposes, it's different. But I mean, he hasn't exactly shown a great enthusiasm for the rule of law and and sovereignty. I think it's fair to say.
You're such a diplomat.
I am. Yeah. DFAT. I'm right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it continues that trend of, the Australian kind of security establishment is desperately trying to hold on to that old narrative, which means now they're having to say, and not explicitly, like not out loud just yet, but the implication is that, oh no, but we're special.
Yeah.
Like, as we said in the show last week, like, oh no, Trump's unreliable when it comes to everybody else, but we are special.
we're
and
fine.
he just makes that harder and harder and harder. And I think it is really hard, evidently. And like, I struggle with this as well. I don't mean this is a criticism, but it is really hard, I think, to deal with an American president who just doesn't have any morality, or, occasionally his ideology is consistent in that it's an ideology of self, like he cares about himself and, his own power and his own ability to make deals and make money. But that's disconcerting, because it upends the framing of Australian foreign policy, or the basic assumptions of Australian foreign policy that have held for decades. And, some are seeing that more quickly and adapting to it more quickly. And I think Xi is one of those people, which is not, I just mean that as an observation.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, the Trump administration is unsettling. Like,
deeply.
The future of Taiwan is a really serious issue. And, millions of people's lives are, potentially at risk.
Yeah.
It's important to recognize the gravity of that situation potentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But maybe that's I think that's a really interesting point, because that's another way that Trump is upending things, because the security establishment and narrative in Australia and the US around Taiwan always had this kind of veneer of that morality that you're talking about, about democracy and the rights of people to self-determination, etc. And like, that was always bullshit for most of those people. Like,
at the very least, unequally applied, as kind of Mark Carney pointed out in his speech.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're playing great power games. Like they're playing Thucydides Trap games, right? Where the world is a giant chessboard.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the chessboard in your background. And Trump is also playing a game. He's explicit about that. Like, he talks about all the time about who holds all the cards.
Yeah.
But his game is different, and there are different rules that he makes up and changes all the time. And that is deeply threatening to people who are used to setting the rules themselves, or used to feeling that the rules, have been consistent since the time of ancient Greece, which was also never true. So all of these established, air quotes, truths are being upended by a president posting on Truth Social.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah. It's all pretty depressing, really.
That's our vibe.
Yeah, that's true. I want to bring it back to the domestic United States, because obviously one of the big implications, I mean, notwithstanding the horrific and unnecessary loss of life in Iran and around the region, but one of the major impacts of the war on Iran has been just global economic chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And that is having an impact in the United States. We've talked previously about polling in the United States and how bad it is. And, I was looking at the latest numbers, the latest YouGov numbers before we recorded, and some of them are like truly horrific for Trump. His net approval rating with black voters in particular was something like -70, which is...
It's comically bad.
It's bad.
Yeah.
And I mean, the major release to come out of this China trip was about soybeans and about how, how historic that arrangement is. And no doubt there are a lot of soybean farmers in the US. Good for them. But it doesn't seem like a soybean announceable is going to do much to move the dial on his domestic political fortunes.
No.
I guess there's two questions here. One is, how does he deal with that? And two, does Trump need to deal with that given all of the significant electoral changes that are kind of underway?
I mean, I don't mean this to sound like a cop-out, but I think the answer to both questions is I don't know. The question of how does he turn it around when the economic damage is already so bad? Things like the rate of farm bankruptcies in the US is incredibly high and going up. The price of things like fertilizer is up so high that it's becoming unobtainable by lots of farmers, meaning they're not planting and blah, blah, blah. And we talk about this often, the ripple effects of what the Trump administration is doing are enormous and they take a while to become completely clear. But this is a disaster for the US economy and a series of broken promises by Trump. So turning it around, of course, is going to involve ending the Iran war, at least as a start. And there's no indication that that is coming anytime soon.
No.
If anything, it's heading towards, a re-escalation of the conflict as the UAE is drawn further in, as no progress is being made on those so-called peace talks, which means, the price of gas continues to go up, the economic fallout continues to grow. Again, and we talk about this all the time, like how rusted on is the base? How effective has the cult of personality been around Trump? And we don't know the answer to that yet. Polling indicates, as we always say, in a normal electoral cycle where you have a president with some voting blocks at 70% disapproval, that's a historic wipeout that you're heading for. But how that plays into this rising cult of authoritarianism around Trump, how that plays into the decimation of the Voting Rights Act, the redistricting that's happening, the other voter suppression measures that are underway, we just don't know the answer to that yet. We do know that Republicans are really worried, and that's why they're racing through these redistricting efforts. That's why some of them are holding on tighter to Trump, because they know that their fates are tied to his. But again, we cannot know, I think, how this is going to play out. And it's been really striking. I was looking at some of those redistricting efforts around the Voting Rights Act, and there's lots of very accurate coverage about how, it won't necessarily make that much difference in terms of the number of seats in Congress, right? It could mean 5 more Republican seats or whatever. When particularly the House of Representatives is already on a fairly slim margin. But none of that coverage that I've seen puts that in the context of everything else that is happening in terms of voter suppression. How is redistricting going to interact with voter suppression in some of those key states? And again, we just don't know the answer to that. Yeah. So it's deeply unsatisfying in terms of commentary and analysis. But I think that's just the reality is that we don't know how this is going to play out. It is just incredibly messy and unpredictable.
Yeah. And I mean, it feels like we're coming into a particularly interesting period too with the 4th of July celebrations, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The World Cup is about to be co-hosted by the United States. The soccer football World Cup is about to be there. There's about to be a UFC fight on the White House lawn. From an outside perspective, it does feel a bit like the crescendo of a movie. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. That's all we've got time for this week, Emma. Thanks so much for joining me on your own show.
Thanks so much, Angus.
And thanks so much to you for joining us. We'll be back next week. If you want to read any analysis from Emma, Alan, or any other Australia Institute experts, you can visit thepoint.com.au. And if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can reach us via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 18th of May, and After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.